And there we are, David. I tell you, there's an amazing time pressure on stuff that's scheduled. How are you today, David?
I'm very well, Jason. It's good to be with you.
It's good to be with you, David. There's a number of troubling conditions that are escalating as time goes on. Not that anyone ever felt that what's happening now wasn't serious, but it's becoming increasingly serious. I did a very short video last night about the recently introduced prohibition on entering any retail store in the city of Manhattan without a medical mask. We've spoken now to two different doctors who have said that this is actually contrary to good health, contrary to preventing viruses. There seems to be fraudulent information that's been disseminated that's causing people to believe this. David, you might even call it fake news.
Well, that's very topical because your marvelous collage shows the epic beauty of Angelina Jolie, a Professor Neil Ferguson, looking presumably at her tattoos,
Right.
an image of, on the left-hand side, of a blown-up face of Bill Gates, and in the background, outside Broadcasting House in London, where you and I, with our epic journey, were in January of last year.
Yeah.
And the frame carries a number of these coronaviruses sort of swimming around in space. And essentially, I think in the show, we can show people the heart of the most amazing conspiracy that involves the BBC's use of sex, fear, greed, and power since it was formed in the late 1920s. Over to you.
Absolutely correct, David. And I'm glad you brought up our trip to London. There's a lot of people who have started watching Crowdsource the Truth just in the past couple months since this pandemic situation has become a worldwide phenomenon. And you and I are doing a sponsor exclusive show each Friday, David, that people can watch on patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards or patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth and subscribestar.com/crowdsourcethetruth. People can go back in the archives of that sponsor exclusive show and see the trip to London. It was eye-opening, David, because we've spoken quite a lot about the statue outside of Broadcasting House, how it was sculpted by a guy named Eric Gill, who I didn't know anything about this guy, so I presume there are a lot of other people who don't. But this is an individual who you've told me has raped his own daughters, is an incredibly questionable person from it's hard to pass moral judgment on someone, but I think most people would agree that rape and incest are immoral acts. He's built this sculpture that depicts a young boy in what appears to be an anal rape scene of an adult man penetrating this naked boy. What can you tell us about all this, David?
Well, Eric Gill is an incredibly talented artist. I think if it is possible to separate the man from his works. But like you said, he raped or at least he had sex with his daughter, his wife, and the family dog. So he was an incredibly convoluted creature, if you will. But the fact that he's
Deviant,
got,
even.
yes, deviant. Of course, we have to be politically correct when we say now, because deviant has many connotations. But anyway, setting that aside, the man was commissioned in 1934 to do a series of sculptures outside Broadcasting House by the BBC, whose Director General at the time was the Lord Reith. And the BBC dates back to the 1920s. But the other statue that we have looked at before, it's got a very interesting set of, a single word attached to it, because you have the image of a naked, sexualized boy Christ up on a crucifix, or it appears to be a crucifix, being serenaded, if that's the right word, by two figures. Because they got wings, I suppose they're angels, although they might be Luciferian characters. But one of the angels is holding a book to the genital area of the boy Christ, and on that book it has the word obsculta, which a listener has pointed out to us is the first word in the Benedictine Creed, and it means listen and obey. And the more I dig into this, and perhaps I've shared that with you, there's a virus in one form, which might have a protein shell and spikes on it, that people can recognize. But I think there's another virus, which you might call a digital virus, which goes around the mind space of people. And obsculta means listen and obey. And I think there are practitioners of a cult where you force people, including children, to listen. And whether or not you're preaching fake news or injecting garbage into their brains, they are obliged to obey. And if they don't obey, they're punished. And they're
Yeah.
punished with a whole variety of punishments or the threats of punishments, including what I believe will be a big part of our show today, the idea of sending asymptomatic carriers into wealthy families or wealthy foundations or wealthy cities or wealthy corporations or wealthy universities, unless, that is to say, it's essentially a global protection racket, I believe, endorsed wittingly or unwittingly by the BBC, unless they pay up, either by believing whatever gut junk you put into their brains or paying up in cash. Over to you.
Yeah, well, paying up is definitely something that they want people to do. It's just so troubling, David. There's so many things going on right now. This listen and obey mantra of the BBC, we see it echoed elsewhere. And the thing that I dislike about it is that it promotes collectivism by attempting to prevent people from thinking for themselves. And we've seen, oops, are you back, David? It still says connection interrupted. Are you back?
Oh, yes, back in.
Okay. I'm just expressing my concerns about collectivist thinking and this concept of being instructed to listen and obey. I mean, it's just not something that a society should be instructed to do because it squelches any challenge to any kind of idea. Another person who's pictured here that's very important in today's show, David, is this guy. What's his name? Ferguson? Neil Ferguson?
Yeah, Professor Neil Ferguson. And he's the head of the Imperial College COVID-19 response team. And it's his models or algorithms that have been used to generate this scare around the world that's resulted in otherwise intelligent people in the United States and Canada and the United Kingdom and Australia and New Zealand in this ridiculous lockdown approach to reducing the rate at which this virus is spread. So he actually probably intentionally or otherwise visited number 10 Downing Street, the home of the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Boris Johnson, I think sometime around the 17th or 18th of March, when he was infectious, but carrying these mild symptoms. So whether he knew he was infectious or not, he presumably shook the hand, gave the presentation of this non-scientific junk to Boris Johnson, who unfortunately went to Oxford and I think studied classics, meaning that he doesn't have the scientific knowledge or capability of reasoning his way out of this. But anyway, Boris Johnson went down with coronavirus, was admitted into St. Thomas Hospital, where the pathology laboratory is run by an outfit called Veerpath, which is owned by or controlled by Serco, back to our favorite corporation that I believe has to be treated with Huawei as a racketeering, influence, and corrupt organization. But perhaps I digress. Back to Boris Johnson. So Boris Johnson is the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Oxford educated. I think he's got his degree in classics, right? Good, powerful character, ostensibly a good, powerful character, right? He was the mayor of London, right? And he was talking prior to going into the hospital about removing the license fee from the BBC. Now, this would be an anathema because, as I told many people, the BBC is the world's premier propaganda, news, and entertainment media that translates its programs into 50 languages, and it has a weekly audience of nearly 500 million people. So, as I pointed out to you, when you and I push what we believe to be the truth or an analysis of a lie, we reach a certain audience. But they, with a lie, that's why it's so important about stopping Angelina Jolie teaching children anything through the arm of the BBC. She would reach perhaps an audience of up to 500 million people where she's investigating or teaching children how to recognize fake news. Over to you.
Yeah, I mean, and my question for the BBC is what qualifies Angelina Jolie to teach anybody anything? I understood you needed to have a master's degree in education to be a teacher. Even without that, I would want to see her having some maybe history and background as a teacher. I think a strong argument could be made, perhaps this is a matter of taste, that Angelina Jolie might be a good actress or perhaps an attractive woman, but I don't know that she's qualified to teach anybody about anything. Why would the BBC and Bill Gates select Angelina Jolie for such a role, David?
Well, I think you have to go back to the work that you and I have done on identifying a group of patents used by the BBC to prompt newsreaders to read stories. And there appears to have been a backdoor installed in that patent, and it's for a spoken text display apparatus to generate television signals that would allow you to inject fake news or send instructions, for example, to demolish a building. Now, if we go back to her career, Angelina Jolie's career, there's a very interesting film that she made in 1995. Do you remember what that was called?
What, the film she made in 1995?
Yeah, she starred, or maybe that was her first starring role.
I don't know.
It was called Hackers,
Oh, right.
about a group of school children, students, who decided they were going to extort a corporation. Now, what
I
does
never
that
saw
remind
the
you of?
film.
Well, I don't think I did, but I've seen excerpts from it. And apparently, it was panned as not a very good film, but then it became something of a cult film for perhaps wannabe hackers to get into a world of nerds, which is, I think, the world inhabited by Bill Gates, and ultimately have a great thrill because you tear down or bring down a legitimate corporation that maybe is offering thousands of jobs to people, is a perfectly legitimate organization that has high integrity engineers and scientists like Boeing. So for me, she is coupled with a subculture that perhaps might be identified by the term obsculta, listen and obey, which seeks to annihilate and destroy and dismantle the kinds of organizations, including universities, foundations, and so on, that we believe are a vital part of the modern world, which gives us a certain quality of life that allows us to increase the longevity of our elderly people and look after them. And when someone like this comes along with that culture, who apparently is so destructive in her relationships with her former husbands, that I believe the divorce lawyer who is advising her, I think it was a Laura Wasser, Wasser, has either threatened or has actually resigned because of the vindictive nature that she was taking towards her ex-husband, Brad Pitt. So you've got an extremely troubled woman. Some people say she's border personality disorder. I don't know what that means. I'm not a psychologist, right? But to take a woman like that out of that culture, and as she gets older, of course, she loses some of the charms that might attract a young man, as visualized on the screen in your collage. And I would imagine that some of these uh, wannabe or recovering stars would like to get another source of income, maybe take on a gig as executive producer of the BBC's education program that is focused on teaching children, I think in the age from 7 to 14, on the difficult skill of recognizing fake news. This woman, I don't say she should be drummed out of town, but independently through my Patreon site, I'm asking the BBC to shut down this program. I don't accept, as an ex-Brit with a fascination for detecting fake news, that this woman has anything to contribute, particularly when that program is funded by Bill Gates. Over to you.
You know, David, I was just looking at this article while you're speaking, and it's important that people join us on patreon.com/reverse-CSI storyboards, patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth, and subscribestar.com/crowdsourcethetruth. I mean, this is TMZ that's reporting this, which many people probably have opinions about, but they certainly are a well-known name for Hollywood reporting, gossip type reporting. And they're saying that Angelina Jolie is making her divorce so hostile, her lawyer is quitting. This is this is from 2 years ago. This is her divorce from Brad Pitt. I don't really follow what's going on with these people, but the concept of a divorce attorney telling you that you're being too hostile, it's reminiscent of when I was in college. The Grateful Dead went on a concert tour with Bob Dylan. They ultimately terminated their collaboration with Bob Dylan because he was too drunk during the performances. And if the Grateful Dead is telling you that you're too chemically affected to work with them, that's a very bad sign. Almost equal to a divorce attorney telling you you're being too contentious. This is like unheard of.
Well, absolutely. And so if we look at these cells that have sprung up, and I might call them an absculta cell, a listen and obey cell, or maybe more conventionally, they're known as Marxist-Leninist cells. This leads me on to probably the most powerful law firm in the world, Sidley Austin, out of Chicago. And they, in their wisdom, decided to choose another possibly borderline personality disordered character by the name of Bernardine Dawn in the 1988 to 1990 period, I think, where Bernardine Dawn, who is the co-founder of the Weatherman Underground terrorist organization with Bill Ayers, she would be on the run in the 1970s. And then she managed to get a gig, I don't know exact year, at teaching at Northwestern University in Chicago. And in 1987, in its wisdom, Sidley Austin took this woman on, apparently, whether that was the intent or otherwise, to groom a woman by the name of Michelle LaVaughn Robinson, who would one day become known as Michelle Obama. And later, towards the end of the 1980s, one Barack Hussein Obama, right? Who would go on to become the President of the United States and the First Lady.
Now, David, let me interrupt for just a second, because this is a very interesting analogy. I was unaware of Bernardine Dawn, and this has been brought to my attention as well. I'm referring to their organization that came out of the Students for a Democratic Society as the Weather Underground. I've also heard it referred to as the Weatherman Underground. Certainly the people who are involved in it are weathermen, but is it the Weather Underground or the Weatherman Underground?
I think that, to me, that's splitting hairs. It's a Marxist-Leninist organization, right? Designed to indoctrinate the cult-like characters that cluster around it with this notion of absculta, listen and obey. That is to say, disengage your brain. I think Somerset Maugham said, when you go to the theater, you engage in the willing suspension of disbelief.
Right.
I mean, this pandemic is a classic example of that, where all kinds of intelligence or reasoning go out of the window because some professor who instigated the model that generated the lockdown philosophy, he's locked down, and his married mistress visits him and presumably engages in something that's less than the acceptable social distances laid down by the Marxist-Leninists, right? Otherwise, why would she visit him? Anyway, that's kind of by the by.
Well, but just to continue on the thought real quick, David, I think it's an important analogy that you've made. I mean, first of all, let's talk about this because, I mean, again, I don't really want to pass judgment on anybody. Let's just observe what we're talking about. I mean, if this guy is having a sexual relationship with a married woman, I think most people would consider that not a moral thing to do in the strictest sense. Additionally, this is a guy who has a long career of relying on or reporting inaccurate estimates. He's at least scientifically incompetent, if not deliberately making these decisions. But, we talk about marital infidelity and that type of thing. Angelina Jolie has been married and divorced many times. So have I. But I'm not, breaking up marriages. She is sort of become famous for that, meeting people on set And I believe Brad Pitt was married to Jennifer Aniston at the time that their relationship began. There was another marriage to Billy Ray Thornton, I think the guy's name was. So she's kind of got a pattern of doing this. The reason why I think the analogy to Bernadine Dorn is important and meaningful, again, I didn't know anything about Bernadine Dorn until you started telling me about her, but a lot of people write to me now, and including viewers who are closer in age to you than they are to me, and they remember when Bernadine Dorn was active and in the news, and these people report to me that she was considered a sex symbol in the sort of anti-war movement, attractive young woman who also engages in some morally questionable things, encouraging murder and whatnot. But I mean, is there some parallel between Angelina Jolie and Bernadine Dorn?
I think they've been infected by the Obsculta virus. Listen and obey. These women, whether they're vulnerable or not, if presumably, and I'm not technically qualified here, if you have the characteristics of borderline personality disorder, that means you exhibit certain behaviors. So, for example, Angelina Jolie would be into mosh pits, I think, where you get in a pit and you bump up against someone and you bruise. It's a very physical encounter. And then in knife playing with her boyfriend when she was a teenager, where they were cutting each other, right? So then they go, and ultimately she gets this career in Hollywood, and she stars in, for example, Hackers. Now, you and I have talked a lot about the scripts that are written prior to these mass casualty events or a high value target being taken out, where subsequently, after the event itself, a whole bunch of seemingly disconnected but coordinated activities take place, including the removal of evidence from the crime scene and the spin that is injected into the news, which shapes the first perceptions of the public at large to the event. So, for example, on 911, we have Jane Stanley of the BBC, presumably in a studio in New York, with a backdrop that shows building number 7 still standing. And she's reading from this prompt patented device. We are getting news that the Salomon Brothers building has collapsed, but it's still standing. So I presume that that patent that sent the signal to the demolition crew, for whatever reason, it was delayed. Maybe they didn't get the fuses in place, and that building comes down 15 minutes later.
Let me ask you a question, David, real quick, because I want to keep you on Angelina Jolie. So here's something
Right.
from the Daily Mail, published originally in 2016, talking about vials of blood, knife play, kissing her brother, lesbian flings, and sexual kindergarten. I don't know anything about that, but this is, I mean, again, BBC is something that British television owners are forced to pay for. So therefore, whatever your personal feelings about any of these things, vials of blood, knife play, kissing her own brother, lesbian flings, and sexual kindergarten, you're not given the opportunity to evaluate this and then decide if you're going to enroll your child in an education program headed up by someone who engages in these activities. You're just basically being forced not only to listen and obey, but to pay.
Yeah, it's the most extraordinary thing. So let me come back to my maybe I should fairly early on in these shows, and I think I've said it before. I believe one day, now whether we're responsible for that or not, there will be people out there who bring a class action suit associated with the wrongful deaths with the use of these patents. The BBC, I think, is moving into a very dangerous zone where it's actually promoting an education system where people like Angelina Jolie, funded by Bill Gates, are going to be teaching our children how to recognize fake news. But we know the company that is the world leader injecting fake news, and it says it is, which is Serco, the British company that runs your patent and trademark office and your national visa center, injects fake news for the UK Cabinet Office to teach governments how to respond to an emergency like this pandemic. Now, if they are providing fake news that is actually misleading, then I think they're responsible for distributing that fake news and getting people to take the wrong decision. My understanding of this ventilator stuff is that when you put a ventilator into a patient right, who's sick and supine and all the rest of it, it changes totally the metabolism of what's taking place in the lungs. And many of these people, it would appear, suffer very painful death as a result of having the ventilator plugged into their lungs. Now, a classic example of that, and it must have been very scary, would be Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. He goes to St. Thomas's Hospital, where the pathology lab is effectively run by a proxy for Serco, and he could have been put on a ventilator and not come out. So I'm saying, well, maybe that's a warning to Boris Johnson. Don't mess with the BBC license fees. It's part of a global protection racket administered or operated, I believe, by people like Bill Gates and the Sidley Austin law firm and Serco in a joint venture with Huawei, which is the Chinese conglomerate that was launched in 1987 in the same year as Serco bought itself out from RCAGB. Over to you.
David, I don't know if you're aware of this, but Guardian journalist Katie Balls writes a story that while on lockdown, Boris Johnson faces a new opponent from his own party. Do you remember the name of the character that was the send-up of Q in the Inspector Clouseau movies? Wasn't it
Yes.
Balls? Balls was
Yes.
the guy making all the
Yes.
costumes for him.
Yes.
So it's a humorous name, but it's an interesting article. I'm curious to know what Prime Minister Johnson says about the BBC television tax now that he's been released. He looks healthy enough, presuming this photograph was taken recently. I mean, this article is published today. What do you think about this?
Well, I think he's got a lot of opposition as long as he doesn't listen and obey, right? Because he doesn't control the shots. And I'll be blunt, I don't think Donald Trump controls the shots. I think they're wrestling with a monster, a giant, an organization that perhaps a flavor of how powerful that is was reflected in JFK's speech in 1961 when he said, "We are opposed by a ruthless and monolithic conspiracy that believes in infiltration and not invasion, and guerrillas by night and not armies by day." So that organization, it's been around way before JFK sensed that it was there and wanted to do something about it. And I believe that particular speech in 1961 was the reason why he was taken out, because the people within that monstrous conspiracy, they persist today and they go back in time way before JFK came along the line. And that's what we're dealing with, you and I. And I think our audience, we can go back to 1984 or 1929 when the JFK, I think the principal conspirators on Wall Street got together with that Kappa Beta Phi. But I don't want to chop around too much because I think the characters of these women are vitally important. Bernadine Dawn seems to be a character very similar to Angelina Jolie. Now, some people might say, well, Angelina Jolie was involved in knife play, but do people know that Bernadine Dawn gave a small seminar in the summer of 2005 at Northwestern University, Torture, Paradigms and Practice? If you look at the body of Angelina Jolie, she's very nicely shaped, I understand, but look at the amount of tattooing and intervention on her body. That's sending a message. If you go around the front, maybe you can show that image, there's an image of a crucifix growing out of her crotch. Right?
I was
Yeah.
going to carefully prepare a version of that image. Let me see if I can find it, because I know many of our viewers will be quite offended if the original image is shown. Why don't you describe it for us while I look for an acceptable version?
Yes, acceptable version. Anyway, that's the tattoo. And very interesting, there's some dog Latin. Dog Latin is a word for, it's not really good Latin. But anyway, there's a phrase by the crucifix, right, which says something to the effect, quod me nutruit, me detruit, which my translation, I did a little bit of Latin at school, but essentially it translates into whomsoever nourishes me or perhaps gives birth to me or whatever, destroys me. Well, is that the image? I mean, I ask the audience, the American audience, let alone the world audience, that's going to have to be listening to this woman trying to teach your children how to recognize fake news. Is that the message that you need for your children to understand? Right? It's basically, I think Karl Marx said something to the effect, abolish marriage, even the most radical flare up at the infamous suggestion of the communists. And now he
Wait
wrote
a
the
minute.
Communist Manifesto.
The
Go ahead.
communists want to abolish marriage, and here we have Angelina Jolie being thrust in front of us by the BBC, a woman who, aside from her acting career, one of the most notable aspects of what she's done is broken up many marriages.
Yes, and if the behavior of abusing your own children, as exemplified by Eric Gill, translating that into a statue outside Broadcasting House, right, which suggests that the BBC is basically committed to a culture that includes the breakup of marriage, right? That is to say, go ahead.
Well, I wanted to bring another blasphemous aspect of this image to your attention, David. We're talking about, Angelina Jolie's tattoo, which, this thankfully is one of the most PG-13 versions of it that I was able to find. But actually seeing it hidden by these pants has caused me to think of another image of blasphemy. I don't know if you've seen the film The Exorcist, about a young child who becomes possessed by the devil and is then exorcised by this priest. It's one of the scariest movies I've ever seen. I haven't seen it since I was a little kid, but one of the things that burned in my brain was when this small child is supposedly possessed by the devil, she does a number of incredibly disturbing things, including penetrating her own vagina with a cross and saying all kinds of things that pious people would find blasphemous, as this priest yells at her and sprinkles holy water on her and tells her that the power of Christ compels you and this kind of thing. He's doing this exorcism, but this imagery is reminiscent of that.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm not an expert on iconography, but you and I have found some amazing relationships between the mural outside, 425 Carroll Street, with a warning. And we had someone on the street who actually said that raven, or whatever it was, the Thunderbird, was a warning signal to the people who live in the downtown east side, which is the poorest coastal district in Canada, which is a pool of victims potentially that could be processed into the world of Bill Gates and his cronies through 425 Carroll Street. And what happened at 425 Carroll Street, as we've established, is that there was an online international service for the development, creation, and distribution of hardcore adult and child pornography and online gaming into 60 countries at the time of the raid of the 20th of August, 1999. We have Bernardine Dawn. I don't want to, chase you around too much, but with that image of something that looks like the star that we see at 425 Carroll Street, or in the neighborhood of 425 Carroll Street. And we have these crucifix symbol, and we have the crucifix in the vicinity of Angelina Jolie's crotch. I think what they're telling us is, first of all, they're laughing at us, and I don't like being laughed at. And secondly, these academics, I have great respect for their brain power, but their integrity, or their moral integrity, I believe is very suspect. And let me just touch on what's happening with this
Sorry, real quick,
coronavirus.
David, while we're on Bernardine Dorn and education, I think it's important that we remind people, in one of her manifestos that was sent to a radio station on audio cassette, I think in 1974, Bernardine Dorn expressly warned the people of the United States to guard their schools. Now we've got Angelina Jolie via Bill Gates and the BBC superseding the schools. We've also heard from the incredibly incompetent, I don't know if I'm going to be so generous as calling him incompetent, but Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York, who has recently issued some executive orders that I personally believe are unconstitutional. I'm going to be looking into that further. But Governor Cuomo has announced that one of the benefits of this coronavirus outbreak is that we have an opportunity to reshape New York's education system, and Cuomo is going to have billionaire Bill Gates play an important role in that. Why do we need Bill Gates, a guy who also doesn't have a master's degree in education, who never finished college? And look at this, he's got Eric Schmidt, the Google guy, involved as well. These people, I'm not interested in having them educate children.
I think this is going to the heart of the matter. And I think this is where we, the people, and I include myself, I'm on the same planet, I'm two-legged, et cetera, and I'm part of the audience that is being assaulted by the BBC, because remember, they'll be doing it in 50 languages. So many of the countries I've worked in around the world who, and I don't mean to be patronizing here, who don't have the education necessary to do ground truthing of fake news. I mean, you and I understand this is a complicated subject. So when this guy, Neil Ferguson, resigns, and he's responsible for the models that generated the expectation of fatalities associated with mad cow disease going back to 2001, and millions of animals and hundreds of thousands of people have died as a result of the misuse of these models, and we're taking the wrong decision. The proper remedy for that, I believe, if that's the nature of your question about these millionaires or billionaires, I believe collectively a group of billionaires have been clubbed together through that Kappa Beta Phi organization on Wall Street, of which Wilbur Ross is a member, of which Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, is a member, right? They have collectively grouped together and put Serco in a position, I believe, to trigger the events of 9/11 and move the asymptomatic carriers around the world to target certain areas, certain cities, certain corporations, or certain families who failed to pay protection money. This is a global protection racket endorsed by the BBC. And I think what's going to happen is they're going to be held responsible unless they do something like right now. Over to you.
Let's stay on Ferguson for a minute, because it's interesting to note that the BBC ran this story about him resigning. Now, the language that they're using is very important, David, and you are someone who respects language and uses it as a tool, and I appreciate that about you. I find language to be very important as well, because subtleties in meaning can often reveal quite a bit about what the topic is. The BBC News would have us believe that Professor Neil Ferguson has quit because he's undermining the lockdown. If I were to write this headline, I would write something more along the lines of Neil Ferguson has exposed the fact that his own predictions are pure crap. Because if he believed what he said, he would not risk his own life by going out and exposing himself to this deadly virus so he could have a sexual tryst with a married woman. But they're spinning this. They're spinning this to cause us to believe that everything that he said was true, and he's just undermined the determination. It's interesting also to note that this quote, social distancing regulations are there for a clear purpose. It's not made by the Prime Minister Boris Johnson. It's made by a spokesman. So we don't really know who that spokesman is.
And I like your comment, because I do think language is vitally important. You see, if someone other than the BBC had said, Neil Ferguson, Professor Neil Ferguson has resigned after discrediting the lockdown.
His own, right.
That would be very different. And the BBC has a perfect opportunity, because the BBC has access to the Johns Hopkins data stream, which is probably built, I can't prove it, on Ferguson's model. So remember, at Event 201 in New York on the 19th of October, sponsored or co-hosted by Johns Hopkins University and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, that was a pandemic with a coronavirus exhibiting mild symptoms, i.e. you could argue something close to an asymptomatic carrier, that had 65 million dead. Well, where do we hear about dead in the millions? We have apparently the man Larry Growell, I think he was, who was an FBI mole who penetrated the Students for a Democratic Society, or the Weather Underground organization. And he got into a conversation with Bill Ayers and Bernardine Dawn on how they would secure their revolution. And apparently, Bill Ayers and Bernardine Dawn were going to establish re-education camps, right, to get the Americans to think along the lines of listen and obey. And those people who couldn't be re-educated would need to be terminated. And Larry Growell said, well, what numbers are we talking about? These clowns said 25 million, right? So you have someone on faculty at Northwestern University, Bernardine Dawn, who gives summer seminars on torture paradigms and practice. She's borderline disorder, I believe. And then you have her husband, Bill Ayers, who's a co-founder of the Weather Underground organization. He's on Chicago, University of Illinois, Chicago, I think it is, or University of Chicago, Illinois. All right. And these are two, I believe, unindicted psychopaths.
I agree with you on that point.
And there's no, go ahead.
Well, sorry, there's no what?
There's no statute of limitations on murder. So let's say back up the food chain. Dr. Judy, I listened to your interview with
Before we switch off of this topic, David. So
Yeah.
Ariana is telling us that her daughter is a teacher, and the daughter has been told that her classes will never be the same when schools go back. Ariana thinks that this virus has been a total setup to change everything in the world. I have to agree with that, just walking around in the streets and observing how New Yorkers are interacting, the inability to purchase things. I also, before we switch topics, because we are running out of time, I just want to point out, David, that what you and I are doing, well, I'll speak for me. I believe this is what you are also doing. But I'm encouraging people, rather than to absculta, rather than listening and obeying, I'm just suggesting that people think for themselves and question everything, including me. And it's interesting to observe that when I just type in Neil Ferguson and tap on news, we're getting 12 million results, the first of which are coming from The Guardian and BBC. I'm interested in learning more about what the relationship is between The Guardian and the BBC, but just scanning the headlines, Guardian tells us that it's not just Ferguson. Scientists are being attacked for telling the truth. So if you read nothing more than the headline, this causes you to believe that Ferguson is a scientist who's telling the truth and he's being attacked. Now, who is he telling the truth to? The public? This woman's husband? It seems like this guy is a liar who is doing the furthest thing from telling the truth. He might be attempting to be honest, but he's totally incompetent in that his data is all wrong. But the BBC, of course, told us that he quit over undermining the lockdown. Nothing at all attributed to the possibility that he quit because his own behavior reveals that his initial findings had to be incorrect, and he knew it. Elon Musk, who I think is a scientist of some kind. He's inventing things and he knows a hell of a lot more about science than I do. He's attacked the guy over absurdly fake science. I know a lot of people have varying opinions about Elon Musk. Telegraph, another British newspaper, tells us that trust in scientists is eroding and we need to get it back. Transparency is more important than ever. I don't know what this means. We'd have to dig into the story. Is trust eroding because scientists are having sex with other men's wives? Is trust eroding because scientists are telling us junk science that's ruining the world and destroying our freedom? I mean, these are ridiculous headlines, David. What do you think about these?
Well, let me just go back to that point about your friends telling you that as a teacher, education of children is going to be changed. Absolutely, because the education of children is going to go online, right? Then you can generate a program of education for the children, which is detached from reality. Now, in the 1980s...
And antisocial.
And, well, Marxist-Leninist or whatever it is, destruction of marriage, et cetera, et cetera. But let me just back up to the 1980s. The oil industry confronted the same problem as people who are not getting justice from the system. Back then in the 1980s, to a lesser extent now because of the contribution I made, the oil industry had the problem. You had multiple specialists confronting the same data sets and coming to different or contradictory conclusions. So a sedimentologist, a petroleum geologist, a geophysicist, a petrophysicist, they'd all look at the same data set, an enormous terabytes of data for a big oil field. And they'll say there's oil there, another one would say there's no oil there, etc. When I came and started my work as a coordinator of artificial intelligence and geoscience research at Schlumberger in Ridgefield in Connecticut, I brought some experience of dealing with real experts who were multidisciplinary, right? Who could take a hypothesis from a sedimentologist, translate that into what the logs or the petrophysicist would see if the sedimentologist was true. So I built a system with a gentleman called Luke Steele's, brilliant man. He's had a couple of degrees in computational linguistics. And I built a system and I wrote that paper that you're showing there. And I urge people to read this because this is a layman's approach, an attempt by written in 1981, to explain what you can get out of expert systems and artificial intelligence and what you can't get. And at all times, if you're listening to the output of an artificial intelligence system or the algorithms probably developed by Neil Ferguson, you're going to generate a hypothesis that needs to be tested against real data. If it doesn't match real data, it's wrong. That is to say, when Neil Ferguson and his colleagues in the academic community started modeling data back in 2001 that resulted in the slaughtering of millions of sheep and cattle on the basis they had foot and mouth disease, that was wrong then. It's morally wrong. It's scientifically wrong. And it's absolute travesty that that man continued to develop these useless models and predict the number of deaths from bovine encephalitis or whatever it is. So there's another quote that the people should, I think, I really like. It's what I tell my friends, is Blaise Pascal, who is a 16th century mathematician. He said, we have a moral obligation to think hard. Now, whether you've got an IQ of 60 or 180, I don't care. I don't care whether you're black or white or yellow or brown, or whether you're a female or a lesbian or heterosexual or whatever. You have everyone, including the children, as early as possible. You have a moral obligation to think hard. You should not accept an education coming through the BBC in 50 different languages into countries where they're not qualified to ground truth these hypotheses in the way that you and I, not uniquely, but we are bringing an audience with us in the court of a public opinion. I believe, I hope, I pray, that's what we're showing people how to do, is to ground truth the kinds of data that is generated synthetically through the models developed by Neil Ferguson. And Neil Ferguson is a fraud, period. He's got enough experience now to know that all of his models have failed completely, but he's used those models together with the BBC and various activist groups associated, I believe, with Bernardine Dawn, the Sidley Austin law firm, Serco, and Huawei, to lock down society as we know it today, right? And I will not accept the education system being changed with its many imperfections from what it was and that I had the benefit of to what they want. I don't accept it. I don't accept it for any relative of mine. And I'm going to bring the BBC to book on this because I believe the BBC is accountable and liable for a fraud generated and perpetrated by Ferguson. And they should, and get off the pot. And basically, I believe they should shut down that program, of which Angelina Jolie is the executive producer, financed by Bill Gates, and convert BBC studios around the world, there's 29, including one in New York, to providing a ground truthing service for a local community, which would very quickly see that what's happening in New York is a manipulated shutdown by extremists that are funded, including the government, by a line of credit from, I believe, those billionaires on Wall Street, the Capabeta 5 people. And I think, and here's, because I know we're running out of time, I believe that meeting of Serco on the 47th floor of the North Tower on the morning of 9/11 was put together by Sidley Austin on the 57th floor. And Sidley Austin had 601 people in the North Tower on 9/11. 600 of them escaped. One person died. And that's absolutely critical because Occam's razor says when you're talking about a crime, the simplest explanation to fit all the facts is the most likely to be true. And the facts that really interest me are the anomalies. Why did Rosemary Smith not get out alive and had someone put a couple of bullets in the back of her head from a Glock? Because she was the switchboard operator. She would have had the early warning sign of an attack on the communication systems in the World Trade Center that I believe switched from Nortel equipment to Huawei equipment that allowed the communist Chinese to coordinate the attack on America of 9/11. And just to remind the audience, Huawei is now in a Brooklyn court facing a RICO charge, that's kind of serious, for serial thefts of intellectual property, right? Including, I believe, the kind of intellectual property I was engaged in the 1980s. I didn't go all the way to a patent, I ran out of money, right? But I think Huawei and Serco are joined at the hip as a racketeering influence and corrupt organization, aided and abetted by the Sidley Austin law firm. Over to you.
Now, David, we've got Salvation Pictures, who's just joined, I guess, asking where is that building of the creepy naked kid being raped by an adult man. This is the BBC Broadcasting House. David and I have spoken about it extensively. I encourage people to join us not only for our upcoming broadcast, which is starting in just under 10 minutes on patreon.com/reverse-CSI storyboards, patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth, and subscribestar.com/crowdsourcethetruth, but to also go back into the archives and take a look at the trip that David and I took to London just a few months ago when people could freely walk about the streets, buy items at whatever store they wanted, and people can take a look. We walked all around that building and, it revealed to us the absolute oblivious nature of virtually every BBC employee. They've got these statues that would seem to promote an affinity for pedophilia. When we take that in combination with the BBC's failure to expose Jimmy Savile, I think this is an organization that is all for raping kids and having people who are trying to destroy marriages and get involved in knife play and blood rituals and matching tattoo rituals and all kinds of things. These are the people they want educating our children. I see, David, more connections to the very subversive Weather Underground and the Students for a Democratic Society when I look at Angelina Jolie than I do to things that I want children to be educated about. So it's a very troubling thing. The one other connection I wanted to make for people, if we're talking about tattooing and body modifications and people who are into things that are maybe outside the sexual parameters of marriage or whatever, a lot of people pointed out during the show that Andrew Cuomo delightfully displayed what appeared to be his nipple barbells when he gave a press conference not long ago. This is a strange thing for an adult man who is the governor to have on display when he's supposed to be talking about the health and safety of his constituents in New York State. I dislike Andrew Cuomo. I don't know the man on a personal level, but he seems to be an enemy of the Constitution, and I don't think he has the right to make some of the decrees that he's been making. But David, we're going to have to continue this conversation in just 5 minutes. We're running out of time for our transition, so I hope people will join us on Patreon and Subscribestar. I'll see you there in just a few minutes.
Thank you, Jason.
And thanks everybody for watching.